In today's video, we're going to be going over the replacement process for front brakes on a Chevy Equinox. So for doing the front brake replacement, it's a pretty simple process. The first thing we're going to do here is lift up the front tire of the vehicle. We're going to remove the tire, and then I'll show you how to take the brakes apart. Now that we got the front tire lifted up off the ground, we're going to remove it. So now that we got the tire off, we're ready to start taking apart and cleaning the brakes. The first thing we're going to want to do is jump under the hood, and we're going to open up the cap on the brake reservoir. We're opening up the cap so when we go to push the piston back in after, that it alleviates the pressure and allows us to smoothly push that piston back in. The brake reservoir cap is back here, so we're just going to crack that open. I leave it in position, and then I always make sure I leave my hood open so I remember to close that when I'm done. So now they're ready to start. We're going to remove the two bolts up here. They're 14 millimeter. The top bolt is here. The bottom bolt is down here. That's going to allow us to release the caliper here. So now that we've got both the top and bottom bolts on the calipers removed, we're ready to take the caliper off. So I grab a small pry bar or a flathead screwdriver, and I'll push in underneath here just to separate this off of the pad. I've also got this S-hook here handy. What we're going to do is attach it into here, and we're going to hook the caliper onto the spring up top. The caliper is now supported. We can start by removing the rest of the bracket here. So now that I've got the caliper here supported, I take the time and push the piston back in right away, just so it's done. There's multiple different ways you can do this. You can use the old pads with a C-clamp. There are specific tools. I just use a big pair of pliers. And what I do is I get onto the metal lip here and the side of the caliper. So I'm making sure when I do this that I'm staying above the rubber grommet here on the inside of the piston. This is also the reason that we open up the cap, because if you tried to do this with that cap closed, you would have a very difficult time compressing that piston back in. So now that the piston is in, we're going to go back to the bracket here and remove the pads. So on the rear, you've got two 18 millimeter bolts here, one here and one here. So we're going to remove those now. So these ones, I make sure I remove one at a time. If you pull out both like I did with the caliper, what ends up happening is you'll drop the bracket. It'll slide right off. So now that the second bolt is removed, you can see the bracket for the pads comes right off in one piece. So now that we're ready to remove the rotor here, sometimes you'll have a little tiny Torx screw in here that needs to come out. This one doesn't have it, so we should be able to just remove the rotor like this, and we can set that aside. So looking at these brake pads, they do have quite a bit of life on them, but the issue that we're running into is stopping on this vehicle on the right hand side. We're getting a bunch of pulsations, a bit of squealing and a kickback. So we're going to swap out the whole front brakes on both sides here. So now that we've got everything apart, we're going to clean up the brakes. So we're going to clean the mounting surface here on the hub. We're also going to clean the bracket for the pads. So in my opinion, this is the most important part about doing brakes, is to make sure that your surfaces are clean so the new brakes fit on there properly. Switching between a wire brush, taking off what we can bulk wise, and then we're going to use the 90-degree air grinder with an abrasive pad. So now that we've got the hub clean to the touch, we're going to throw on just a slight amount of anti-seize onto the hub. If you live in a very salty climate, like Canada or some parts of the US, this will help you be able to remove the rotor down the road again without having any issues of it sticking. So you can now see I have a slight amount of anti-seize on where the hub's going to meet the rotor. I like to make sure when I go to put my rotor on that I have clean hands, so I always wear gloves when I'm using the anti-seize and brake lubricant to make sure I don't get it on the actual rotor. So now that I've got the rotor on, you can see because there's no tension, the rotor wants to fall. So what I do is I use a large nut on the bottom here and a lug nut. This will allow you to put tension on the rotor. That'll keep the rotor in position now. So now that we've got the new rotor installed, we're going to follow a similar process here when it comes to cleaning. We're going to remove the old pads and we're going to clean up all the mounting portions. So this side, and also where it meets the back of the mounting here, we're going to clean up the surface a bit here too. And we're going to make sure that these sliders have enough lubricant and they're not binding it. So now that we've got our mounting surfaces cleaned, what we're going to do is just pop out these sliders here quick. We're going to clean them off and just add a little bit of clean fluid. So now that we've done the bottom and the top one, we're ready to start installing our pads. So now that we're ready to install the brackets, I like to use just again a little bit of brake lube here, and I'll throw it down where the bracket is actually just going to meet the housing here. Do this on both sides. And I use just a very small amount here. So I also add a little bit of brake lube on the ears of the pads here. That is definitely preference. Some people don't like that, some people do. I also will install the pads prior to mounting the bracket back on the vehicle. That makes it a little bit easier to get that back on there and not have to fight from installing the pad in the rear. So when you're looking at the pads here, this is how you can tell that this one is for the rear of the housing here. So because it's going to install this way onto the vehicle, we know that this will be the back one here. So now they're ready to install the pad. We're going to start with the rear one. That will be the one with the squealer tab on it. And we know the way the bracket mounts, it's going to go here. So this is going to be this side. So we're now going to just throw a little bit of lubricant on the ears of the front pad, and then we'll install the front one too. So we're now ready to install our front pads. So this is going to be a little bit tricky sometimes because these pads are not going to want to stay on when you do the opposite one. So we've got both pads on now. So what I'm going to do is just clean my hands here quick. We're going to spray down the rotor with a little bit of brake clean, and then we're going to get these pads mounted. So I'm going to quickly just spray down my rotor with some brake clean. And we're now ready to install the bracket here. So I make sure I have one of my bolts handy, and I make sure when I go to put this on, I'm holding enough pressure on both pads so they don't fall out. I'm going to line up the bracket here, throw in my top bolt. We're just going to get it in as tight as it goes by hand. And now I can throw on the bottom one. So it is a bit tricky sometimes installing these with the pads in the bracket already, but it's also just as tricky sometimes to get these rear pads in when you have the bracket on, you're fighting from behind. So one of the final things we're going to do is we're going to throw a little bit of the brake lubricant also on the inside here where this is going to meet the pad as well. So again, I'm not putting a excessive amount on here, just a bit so the metal has something to slide against. So you can see having the large nut plus the bolts here on the rotor has made it extremely easy to put these pads and caliper back on without needing to fight and trying to keep that level. So we're going to switch back to our 14 millimeter and tighten these down. So we got both of those tight, and we're now ready to move on to the opposite side. So now that we're ready to start the other side, we're going to do the same thing. The vehicle's lifted. We're going to remove the tire. So now that we've got the tire removed, we're able to repeat the same process on this side. We're going to take off this top bolt, which is the 14mm, and as well as the bottom. We're ready again to remove the caliper and hang it. We're going to pop off the back two 18s, then we're going to push our piston in. So like before, we're going to take the bottom off first, and then we'll get our top off. We'll now remove the rotor. And we're going to go over the same cleaning process again. So our hub's clean, and we've got a small amount of the anti-seize on it again, where it's going to mount to the rotor, so we can now install the new rotor. So again, as we go to install the rotor, we have our big bolt and our lug nut, so we can tighten this down. We're now going to clean the pad bracket again. So again, we're going to clean everything off here. So now that we've got the bracket kind of cleaned up, we're just going to check our sliders again, re-grease, and then grease the mounting points where the pads are going to sit. So we're now going to add just a little bit of grease back over here again. as well as on the other side. So again, we're going to add just a little bit on the ears. And we know this is the back side here again. And we know this is our back side here again. So before we install the pads again, we're just going to hit the rotor with some brake clean. We've got our top bolt. We're going to slide these back on top of the rotor again. So I find applying pressure to the rotor will allow you to hold this in position to get this top bolt in. And this will make it so your pads don't fall. So final step before we put on the caliper is we're just going to hit the spot where the pads are going to mount and a bit on the surface here. We've got our 2 bolts. So we've now got the large nut and lug nut removed, so we can throw the tire back on. And once we've got the tires back on, we're going to torque them down. So now that we've got the wheels on and they're torqued, we have 2 more things you can do before you take the vehicle for a test drive. We need to jump back underneath the hood, close the cap on the brake reservoir, and we need to jump inside the vehicle and pump the brake. You want to make sure that the pads are pushed up against the rotors here, so when you pump the brakes, it's going to apply pressure back on those calipers and push that back out. So again, we're going to close the cap on the brake reservoir, and let's jump inside and push the brakes down. So as you push the brakes, you'll feel it drop right to the floor, and then you'll get a few more pushes out and you'll find that the pads have pushed themselves up against the rotors. So you're now able to take the vehicle for a test drive. Now that we're back from our test drive, the brakes are functioning correctly. This has been a quick video showing how easy it is to replace the brakes on a Chevrolet Equinox. If you enjoyed this video, like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.